Knowing about education changes is something that people often overlook in their exams, and there are a great deal of educational changes that occurred from 1855 to 1964. As you're about to see, the mostly illiterate Russian population ended up by 1964 being mostly literate and educated. So they certainly gained something. However, at certain times the Russian people did lose out. To begin with, Alexander II didn't do much about education, and what little education provision existed was either private school, paid for by families that were wealthy enough to send their children to school, or charitable schools, paid for by charitable people, or churches. However, Alexander II did begin to make changes, and by the end of his reign, the number of people in secondary education doubled. As your first stat. Alexander II also put responsibility for the administration and expansion of primary education in the hands of the Zemstva, who, though always blighted by a lack of funds, did actually enjoy some success in helping more Russian children into primary education. Alexander also introduced a new type of school called gymnasia. It wasn't just a PE school, though. It was where students were not taught the same subjects as they would have been had they attended the traditional private grammar schools, which still continue to exist. In gymnasia, people were taught with an emphasis on science, languages, and maths, all subjects that would go on to help people in careers in industry. In this sense, the changes went hand in hand with the new focus on heavy industry. With regards to university, Alexander II gave universities a greater deal of autonomy, which means they could decide their own things. They allowed them to control more of what was taught, although central government did retain ultimate control and could stop things that they didn't approve of. And then along came Alexander III, who was, as you should be aware, a more repressive ruler than Alexander II, and he made certain changes that fitted in with what became known as a reactionary period of rule. For example, Tolstoy, Minister for Education, took away some of the authority that the Zemstva had had under Alexander II, and made sure that there was greater central government control of education. Tolstoy also campaigned to ensure that only people who attended typical grammar schools would be able to attend university, so as to make the gymnasia that were developed under Alexander II a bit less valuable. Tolstoy didn't stop there. He clearly didn't like poor people, because he manipulated the entrance criteria to universities so that it virtually excluded all lower and middle class children. He didn't even stop there. His contempt for poor people was very, very, very severe. He totally banned lower class children from attending secondary school. So then they really had no chance of getting to university. Perhaps the rationale for this was that they wanted the lower classes to be literate so that they'd be more useful in the workplace. But they didn't want them to be so educated that they might become revolutionary and question their station in life. Nicholas was repressive in some ways and reforming in others. For example, under Nicholas, all meetings at university that were of a non-academic nature were banned, and therefore he banned extracurricular clubs. Sadly, there would be no ultimate frisbee in Nicholas's Russian universities. He also ensured that if student demonstrations got too big or unruly, then local forces would be allowed to disperse the groups using whips, and then afterwards students could be arbitrarily expelled, which means there didn't need to be a reason. You could just expel anybody that you suspected. However, despite the clampdown on universities, Nicholas was the first ruler to publicly announce his intention to provide education for every child, and he did make progress in increasing the numbers of students attending primary school, though his fall in February 1917 stopped him from achieving his goal. So, in reference to our question, the people of Russia gained a lot under Alexander II, lost some of that under Alexander III, and universities in particular lost some more under Nicholas, but generally speaking, literacy rates increased, and more people had access to some education by the time autocracy was overthrown. So under the Tsars, over the whole period, the Russian people gained more than they lost. The provisional government was not really around for long enough to have any significant impact on education, and it was mostly too preoccupied with trying to win the war. Under Lenin, the most significant development was that church schools were to be disbanded, and all schools were to come under total control of the state. Obviously, Lenin probably disbanded church schools because of the whole opium of the masses thing. However, as with the provisional government, conflict must have prevented any significant focus on education under Lenin. He did replace gymnasia with polytechnics, which did very similar things under a different name, in terms of giving secondary school pupils that attended them the skills for a career in industry. Stalin made some large changes. Under Stalin, the number of students attending secondary school rose from 2.5 million children to 6.9 million, and the numbers that attended primary school rose from 8 million children to 18 million, as a result of Stalin making primary school education compulsory for all up until the age of 12. When Stalin decided something would happen, it pretty much did, because of his totalitarian grip on the country, and this is a prime example. Stalin also returned the country to a mix of grammar and polytechnic schools, partly because there was a need for educated bureaucrats in the Stalinist model of government, and without grammar schools people weren't getting the education that would be required of a bureaucrat. However, university courses became narrower and more focused almost entirely on particular roles in industry. In addition, there's evidence that Stalin used education to help to indoctrinate the young into the Bolshevik ideology. There was a boy called Pavly Morozov, look him up on Google, and he was made into a martyr for denouncing his father to his teacher, and subsequently being killed by his own family. His story was taught to students as an example of a heroic, patriotic young man who was willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice, even against his own family, for the sake of Bolshevism. The story of Morozov was used to try to encourage young people to be willing to denounce their own parents, but also to be unquestionably loyal to Bolshevism. Khrushchev's greatest achievement in education was to be the first ruler to introduce free secondary education for everyone. Khrushchev also had the textbooks rewritten as part of his de-Stalinization policy, so that Stalin wouldn't be glorified in Russian education, as he once had been. But he mostly kept the Stalinist educational structures in place because they seemed to fit the needs of the Russian economy. So, in educational terms, it's difficult to argue that the Russian people lost more than they gained. There are countless examples of the Russian people gaining in education, though with perhaps the exception of the period under Alexander III when Tolstoy repressed the education of anyone who wasn't upper class. A Russian person in 1855 was more likely to be illiterate than literate, but by the end of the period, a typical Russian person would have attended both primary and secondary school, in addition to having the opportunity or the potential to go to university, so long as they didn't have what could have been seen as anti-establishment views. So, the Russian people pretty much gained quite a bit more than they lost in terms of education.